What is up, everybody? Welcome to the Eddie Liger Power Hour. Got a great show planned for you today. We're going to ask the question, has Putin fooled the Western left? Of course, he hasn't. If anything, NATO has fooled the Western left. We all know this. We'll also potentially talk about the difference between Michael Parenti's Inventing Reality and Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent, which are both books that attempt to analyze American propaganda and American news media from a leftist / Marxist perspective. And then finally, we will discuss 9/11. I know it's a little bit late, about 7 days too late. But on 9/11 and in the following days, I did a bunch of research about Tower 7, about the towers, about CIA knowledge of who the hijackers were that they had prior to the terrorist attacks actually being carried out. So a lot of interesting stuff. Hopefully we get to all of it today. If not, we'll cover the stories that we don't get to in the future. I do have wrestling practice at 4. Got to go get huge and beat people up and get tougher at 4 o'clock. So that's my hard cutoff. But we'll get through as much information about the Western capitalist empire as we can before I got to leave for practice. And we'll jump right into it after the intro. A radical redistribution of political and economic power. Very cool. First of all, let me wish a happy birthday to our boy Sebastian. Feliz cumpleaños, camarada. Hope you're having an excellent day. This stream is dedicated to Sebastian, who was born in New York City a week after 9/11. That's pretty crazy. What a time to be born. It makes sense that you're a communist now after being born in New York, in the greatest state of turmoil that it's probably ever been in. After the terrorist attacks by terrorists who were previously funded and armed by the United States, which were used to justify the illegal war in Iraq and the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. Only makes sense that now as an adult you're fighting against imperialism, Sebastian. Song always gets me pumped AF. Me too. Some people have been saying we should update the intro to make it something more modern. And I agree in some ways, and I have some ideas, and I've worked on some alternate intros, but at the same time, the International is pretty awesome. And it's right in line with our history as socialists. It's good to remember the historical figures who came before us, honestly. Thank you so much, Grape Juice, for the super chat. Appreciate you very much. Obviously, all of our funding at the Midwestern Marx Institute comes from super chats, comes from Patreon supporters, comes from you, the audience. We got no big-time funders. I'm working on it. I'm working on seducing a billionaire, an Italian billionaire who will then fund Midwestern Marx. But so far, I haven't been able to do it. Eventually, though. 1 billion Americans by 2050. Do you agree with it? I don't know. I haven't looked into the population statistics or how it's expected to grow, but I wouldn't be surprised. Thank you so much, neoliberal shill, for the $2 super chat, helping out some Marxists. I guess you're not a neoliberal shill after all. Hey, Eddie, recent TikTok about fascism and capitalism. Yeah, I definitely will react to that at some point, Jacob, even if not today. Today we're a little bit crunched for time because we have 3 big stories that in the last few streams with Carlos, I've told people that I have all these awesome stories sitting on the back burner that I haven't been able to get to yet, and I'm really excited to. The first soup makes you strong. I agree. I just watched that Adam Sandler Halloween movie last night with my roommate, where he carries around like a thermos full of soup the whole time, and it can turn into like a grappling hook. It was one of the dumbest movies I've ever watched, but I think Adam Sandler's funny. Thank you, Sebastian. Another super chat before we even really get into the meat of our stream here. I appreciate it. So I came across a video. Some of you may have seen this on Twitter. I came across a video called How Putin Fooled the Western Left. And it was a picture of Glenn Greenwald, Noam Chomsky, and Jeffrey Sachs. So this guy, Vlad Vexler, something like that, is going to make the argument that Putin has the Western left fooled. And everybody criticizing what the U.S. is doing in Ukraine is just a puppet of Putin. They've been deceived by Russian propaganda. They're not as intelligent as this guy Vlad here, who is apparently smarter than Noam Chomsky, Jeffrey Sachs, and Glenn Greenwald put together. So let's check this video out. I want to show you guys the thumbnail that I'm talking about here. That's what I'm trying to pull up right now. That's why my camera is shaking uncontrollably, very unprofessional, but appeasers. These are Putin appeasers. Noam Chomsky, the anarchist. Jeffrey Sachs, the normal academic guy who just recognizes that what the neocon U.S. government is doing right now in Ukraine is insane and pushing us towards World War III. And Glenn Greenwald, the journalist. These are all appeasers of Putin, according to Vlad Vexler. So here's the 2 pages of notes I have on this ridiculous nonsense. Let's jump right into it.
But let's talk about why the anti-imperialist Western left is soft on Putin's extreme imperialist violence. We're talking titans of left intelligentsia, Noam Chomsky, Jeffrey Sachs, Cornel West, Richard Wolff. And we're also talking about the so-called alt-left, Glenn Greenwald, Aaron Mattei, Tulsi Gabbard, Matt Taibbi. All these voices failed to get what Putin's politics is all about. They're skeptical of support in Ukraine, and they don't see how Russia's imperialist implosion threatens us in the West. We're going to lovingly expose their ideas, ask why they're misguided, and what the real-world consequences are. To understand.
So this guy, I've seen him before. He makes propaganda arguments from, a very, I don't even know how to say it. He uses academic language, and he uses a very measured tone. He doesn't freak out and scream, Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine. Everyone who disagrees with me is a Putin propagandist. I mean, that's ultimately what he's saying. As everyone who disagrees with me, including these intellectual titans of the left, are just Putin propagandists. But he says it in a way that's dressed up with a lot of academic language, and in a way where he's trying to sound objective, right? He's trying to sound unbiased and non-ideological, when in reality he's extremely ideological.
Understand how Putin fooled the Western left over Ukraine, we have to turn back to the tumultuous months before the invasion. On 17 December 2021, Putin issued an ultimatum to the West, which made it clear that he thought that all of Eastern Europe should be his sphere of influence. Good afternoon, dear. A week later, he upped the ante at an annual press conference in Moscow.
We said not an inch to the east. That was a NATO guarantee in 1990. So what became of that? They fooled us. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We witnessed 5 waves of NATO expansion. Why can't they understand? What is unclear? I believe everything is clear. We are thinking about our own security.
Putin concludes we are not threatening anybody, so long as we get Eastern Europe back, and so long as the West makes amends for fooling us about not 1 inch of NATO expansion to the east.
So did you notice how he lied there? He said that Putin said, we want Eastern Europe back. We want Eastern Europe to be under Russian control, when in reality, that's not what he said at all. What Putin said is, we don't want the West, we don't want American-led NATO to expand their sphere of influence all the way through Eastern Europe, further than they already have into Eastern Europe through the first 5 waves of expansion that he mentioned, right up to Russia's borders. And they consistently said over and over and over and over again, Ukraine is a red line. If NATO starts infringing into Ukrainian territory and building up troop presence in Ukraine, or trying to add Ukraine to NATO, which NATO was doing, everything except adding Ukraine to NATO. They were training soldiers. They had a troop presence. Obviously, they were arming and funding preferred groups in Ukraine. And Russia had repeatedly said, if you do that, we're going to act. We're going to intervene. We're going to do something about it. We're going to take that as a threat to our national security. So it's not them saying you need to allow us to control all of Eastern Europe so we can bring back the Russian Empire or whatever. He's saying we don't want NATO troops on our border. But Vlad here twists his words to try and play on this old trope of Russian imperialism and claim that, you know, Russia was trying to control all of Eastern Europe. And if you wonder why Russia is so afraid of NATO, you know, and why Russia sees it as a security threat that NATO's expanding troops all the way up to Russia's borders, just look at what NATO did in Libya. Just look at what NATO did to Syria. Just look at what NATO did to Afghanistan. Or, more importantly and more relevantly, not more importantly, but more relevant, look at what they did to Yugoslavia. Look at the way they carpet bombed Serbia and funded the worst extremist groups in that region, such as the Kosovo Liberation Army, who were classified as a terrorist group for years before the U.S. started arming and funding them. That in itself expanded NATO closer to Russia's borders. That expanded NATO into Eastern Europe, dismantling Yugoslavia and creating Kosovo, where now there's more NATO troops stationed than any other place on earth. So not only was that a violent intervention from NATO, but it moved them closer to Russia's borders. And then these people still want to act like Russia has no reason to be scared of NATO, or no reason to respond to NATO expanding their sphere of influence that far.
East. Whether that promise was really made, we'll come back to later. What Putin is really saying is, we resent the outside world for being mean to us. The United States runs everything, and we resent it, and we demand a new international order now.
I don't think they're mad at the U.S. for being mean. I think they're scared the U.S. is going to carpet bomb them like they did to Serbia. I think they're scared the U.S. is going to topple their central government and allow slavery and violence and civil war to come back to their country the same way they did to Libya within this decade, or the same way they tried to do in Syria, but Russia and the Syrian government stopped them. The same way they did to Iraq. They're not scared of the U.S. being mean. They're scared of the U.S. doing regime change. And you might want to downplay that, Vlad Flexler. But U.S.-led regime change and NATO-led regime change has destabilized countries all around the world in the past 20 years and made millions of people's lives worse and destroyed what were formerly very prosperous nations. That is NATO's track record, whether you like it or not. So it's not Russia being a baby and being, you're mean. It's Russia saying, hey, you guys have troops right on our border now. We don't want you to do regime change here like you did to Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq. I mean, Iraq wasn't NATO, but it was the U.S. who's the leader of NATO. These people are so naive about NATO, right? They're so naive about the intentions of NATO. Even when you have Angela Merkel, the prime minister of Germany, saying that there was no intention for the U.S. to ever follow the Minsk Accords, which would keep NATO out of Ukraine and keep Ukraine and Russia in a state of peace, right? Angela Merkel said that the U.S. and NATO were looking at Minsk as a way to buy time so they could keep building up a troop presence in Ukraine. But yeah, it all happened because Putin thought America was mean. Like, what a childish view of the current geopolitical situation. But that's what they want to do. They want to simplify it so they can oversimplify it so they can lie about it.
This was just the latest in a long line of Putin's increasingly radical statements on NATO. But to many, it felt like a key moment. Russia observers were beginning to feel that Putin might really be on the warpath.
Russian armor is massing near the border with Ukraine. At the same time, Moscow is demanding an end to NATO enlargement and NATO military activity in Eastern Europe.
Russian President Vladimir Putin is blaming the U.S. and NATO for worsening tensions in Eastern Europe. He does not want a war, but he's demanding immediate guarantees from the U.S. and NATO.
But for many leftist thinkers, Putin's stated concerns about Russia's security were legitimate and needed to be taken at face value. And when they listened to Putin's incredible list of demands, they bought Putin's suggestion that what he was asking for wasn't that much.
A massive...
They don't think this just because of Putin. These left intellectuals didn't just hear Putin's speech and gobble up everything he said. You can look at where all the U.S. money and NED money and NGO money was going in Ukraine prior to the 2014 coup, right? You can see that there were U.S. officials visiting the Euromaidan protests and trying to rile up the protesters. You can see U.S. fingerprints all over Ukraine, especially in the overthrow of their government, but every step of the way in the lead up to this conflict. Right? And then you can take into account what Russia's saying. Russia was saying, quit expanding NATO or we're going to take that as a security threat. They didn't just start saying that in 2022. They had been saying that forever. Right? So these left intellectuals aren't gobbling up Putin propaganda. They're stating what should be obvious to everybody.
Just a few months later, in May 2022, the famous philosopher, scientist, and moralist Noam Chomsky went on leftist journalist Owen Jones's podcast and essentially blamed the war on American interventions.
The State Department officially stated that in the period up to the invasion, the U.S. refused to consider any Russian security concerns. Okay.
In Chomsky's view,
Based Chomsky, he's had a really good take about this entire Ukraine war. In his last book, The Withdrawal, I believe, was published before the Russian intervention was launched, before or just after. And, he's been saying this stuff for a long time. He was saying this stuff prior to the Russian intervention even happening. A lot of these good intellectuals who have a deep understanding of geopolitics were, because they understood that what the U.S. was doing was extremely aggressive and extremely provocative of another nuclear power.
Russia's security grievances caused by successive U.S. administrations breaking that promise to not expand NATO 1 inch to the east were ignored, while Putin's stated goals in Ukraine, demilitarization, neutralization, were exaggerated by the U.S. propaganda system to seem less legitimate than they were. Meanwhile, the U.S. rode roughshod over Ukraine's desire for peace with its aggressive neighbor.
The record all the way through.
It's a really good explanation of what happened.
Is Ukraine seeking some kind of peaceful settlement, the U.S. refusing to accept it, and in fact moving the opposite direction to undermine it, and Britain, of course, Blairist Britain, politely shining Washington's shoes.
In this view, the war is largely a product of American actions imposed on Ukraine and Russia. Here is Jeffrey Sachs, economist and public policy expert. Jeffrey says that the American neocon project of creating a unipolar American world, which is what led to NATO expanding right up till Russia's border, is in good part responsible for Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Based Jeffrey Sachs?
Explicit goal was to surround Russia in the Black Sea. President Putin came in. He was not anti-European. He was not anti-American. What he saw, though, was the incredible arrogance of the United States, the expansion of NATO, the wars in Iraq, the covert war in Syria, the war in Libya against the UN resolution. So we created so much of what we're facing right now through our own ineptitude and arrogance. There was no linear determination. It was step-by-step U.S. arrogance that has helped to bring us to where we are today.
That's
based, Jeffrey Sachs. Based.
The left. But what about the alt left? The alt left is...
Oh my, kill me. The alt left, every day we stray further from God.
Sociologically different from the left, but it largely uses the same arguments. If the left is driven by traditional critiques of US imperialism, the alt left is driven by participation in the culture wars.
I hate that alt left is a term that that's so popular that people are just using it now and they don't even feel the need to really explain it. The gray zone, they're alt left because they don't promote liberal social policies or, liberal culture war views, and they criticize the U.S. State Department and U.S. foreign policy and NATO. Therefore, they're the alt-left. Like, seriously, kill me.
And responsiveness to the crisis of trust in public institutions in the West. So it's here goes the evil American empire again versus our institutions are corrupt and we can't trust anything they do anymore. Here is Tulsi Gabbard.
So what we're seeing play out now is essentially a proxy war. U.S. is engaging in a proxy war with Russia, waging this war using the Ukrainian military.
Oh, wait, this is the alt-left? So the alt-left is when you go on Joe Rogan's show and say things that are objectively true? Oh, okay.
Military and people as their chess pieces in this geopolitical chess game. The ultimate objective being regime change with Russia.
They're all arguing that since the war was America's to start and profit from, it is also America's to end. A key facet of the Western left's critique is that it is possible to off-ram, that opportunities for peace have been missed and sabotaged, and that a solution is still available if we pursue negotiations and diplomacy.
That is true. Multiple reports, even from Ukrainian media, have said that there was a peace plan on the table in 2022. And the United States sent Boris Johnson to break it up and tell Zelensky, no, we're not trying to appease Putin, and signing a peace deal, bringing this horrific, deadly war to an end would be appeasing Putin. So we need to keep fighting, keep fighting, keep fighting. Or more accurately, the Ukrainians need to keep fighting, keep fighting, keep fighting at the behest of NATO. And we know that the U.S. empire, whenever they can, they will use proxies. They will not send American forces in directly. And that's exactly what they're trying to do with the Ukrainians here, using them as cannon fodder. And it becomes very, very hard to deny that when you know that there was a peace agreement on the table and NATO went out of their way to break it up. Right? And this was reported by not just Russian media or not just Putin or not just Russian propaganda. This was reported by Ukrainian media outlets, Western media outlets, various sources within the Ukrainian government even. And here's another report from People's Dispatch saying that peace talks between Russia and Ukraine had stalled amidst massive pressure from NATO and the West. So again, NATO and the West saying, no, 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 bringing the war to an end and, halting the march towards World War III and having peace in Eastern Europe, that's appeasing Putin. We can't work towards peace. Any kind of peace deal is appeasing Putin, right? So we have to keep fighting. We have to keep killing people. We need to keep pushing Ukrainians into the Russian meat grinder, into the Russian military.
Here is economist and public intellectual Richard Wolff.
My conclusion,
Based
and that of many around the world: stop it. End this war, sit down the two sides, work out an acceptable agreement. Anything is safer and better for the world than continuing down the unknowable, dangerous path that we are now on.
And here is Chomsky again.
Possibly there's one way to bring the agony to an end quickly. That's negotiations and diplomacy. There's no other way. That means, in this case, offering Putin some kind of escape hatch, some way to get out without.
And what the U.S. keeps saying is, no, 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 we can't do that. We can't yield any of Ukraine to Russia. They need to have complete liberation, which means they want Crimea back and they want Donetsk, Lugansk, and the Donbass regions back. When Donetsk and Lugansk, the people of these places voted to become independent and then voted to join Russia. They don't want to be part of Ukraine. Same with Crimea, who voted in 2014 to join Russia. And in 1991, when the Soviet Union dissolved, they voted to become independent. Crimea has never, ever, ever wanted to be part of Ukraine. But what NATO keeps saying is we have to keep the war going. We need to keep people dying until Ukraine gets Crimea and the Donbass back. Well, the people of Crimea and the Donbass don't want to be part of Ukraine because they were getting shelled and shot by Nazis ever since the Ukrainian government was toppled with U.S. help in 2014. So it's just an absurd argument from NATO, the U.S., and Vlad Vexler here, which is why the title of this video shouldn't be how Putin fooled the Western left. It should be how NATO fooled the Western left. How NATO fooled Vlad. Oh, Vladdy boy.
Admitting total defeat. That's diplomacy. Well, if you reject it, you're carrying out a grotesque experiment, gambling with the lives of Ukrainians and, in fact, the world. And that's the experiment that the US and Britain are undertaking.
Chomsky has roots in Ukraine. His father was born there. And he is a significant intellectual outside the realm of politics. And some of the other people, maybe people you admire, you have a relationship with. But they are not right. First, most centrally, they are misreading why Putin invaded Ukraine. And because they are misreading why the war began, they're unable to understand the ongoing dynamics driving the conflict.
Okay, let's hear it, Vlad.
So let's go back to Putin's December 2021 ultimatum and the causes of the war. Everything we've seen from the left and from the old left tends to capture the causes of the war in terms of Russia's national security, as expressed in Putin's ultimatum. But in reality, it's a lot more complex than that. There are two primary explanatory pillars driving the causation of the war, and actually neither of them can be mapped onto NATO expansion. Let's start with the first pillar, regime security. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2014 and the full-scale...
It's not national security they're worried about. It's regime security. We'll just change the name from national to regime. They're not defending their government and their sovereignty and their right to have a nation state. They're defending the regime. So you're just going to call the government a regime because it sounds worse and say they're defending the regime instead of their own national security? Jesus Christ.
Invasion in 2022 were done in good part to avert regime erosion at home. In the pre-2022 world, Putin was playing president by outsourcing his presidential...
See, and if Putin cared about democracy, he would just allow NATO to topple his government. But he's protecting the regime.
Powers to his court and then arbitrating, refereeing conflicts within his court. And at one point he felt that his refereeing powers had shrunk, and to gain them back he thought he needed war.
So Putin is both a dictator who has full control of the courts, full control of the country, tyrannical dictator, but he also needs to start a war so he can get more control of the courts. Right? It's this thing they always do with enemies of the U.S. They're both all-powerful and completely weak and fragile at the same time.
There is another factor. Putin felt that the younger generation was drifting away from him, and he could put a lid on top of them via a war. Putin hoped, and he still does, that a big conflict against the West, a militarization of Russian society, will allow him to skip a generation, bringing about that today's Russian children grow up to become Putin supporters. The second pillar.
So Putin needs to trick the young people and needs to trick Russians into supporting him. Keep in mind, again, he's a tyrannical dictator who controls all of Russia with an iron fist, but he also needs to start a war in order to get the people to support him. Well, Putin's support, public support, has gone up during this war, as often happens in a country when they go to war. But let's look at Putin's support since 2000 or since 1999. Look at this. It barely ever dips below 75%. For the majority of Putin's political career, even well before the special military was launched here in 2022, he was extremely popular among Russian citizens. He was, I mean, like Putin or not, it's extremely difficult to deny. Look, at this point, he had 89% approval. There are all these points in Russian history where he had far higher approval than what he does now. So this argument that Putin needed to start a whole war, that he needed to invade Ukraine in order to trick Russians into liking him, that just doesn't line up with the data. And notice how Vlad Vexler here doesn't bring up any data or bring up any facts. He does actually show the counter argument to his own argument, which is nice, but he doesn't bring up any facts here to prove that Putin needs to control the court or that Putin needs to control younger Russians. He doesn't say, here, look at the declining percentage of support among younger Russians. Because if he showed the Russians who have supported Putin historically, or Putin's approval rating, it would blow up pillar one of his argument.
Of the explanation for what is about national security, kind of, but not in the way our leftist heroes would have us believe. Putin's conception of national security is both more radical and more mystical than their understanding allows. Between 2010 and 2014, Putin developed a sense of mission, and Putin, the amateur historian, began making self-aggrandizing ventures into the past, looking for role models for himself. And he came to think,
oh my gosh, Putin's a czar. Putin wants to restore the Russian Empire. We have no evidence for this other than this statue. Because, you know, we don't have any statues of old, outdated historical figures here in America. This proves it.
Perhaps Alexander III, that he was special. He got the feeling that Russia's cultural destiny was now tied to...
First, before we talk about this ridiculous, you know, trying to say Putin wants to be a Russian czar without any evidence other than a video of Putin looking at a statue of one of the czars. Let's talk about the idea that NATO is not a national security threat to Russia. He said that, you know, these left intellectuals think that NATO is a threat to Russia's national security, which is mystical. They have a mystical understanding of how NATO works. No, Vlad, they have a very material understanding of how NATO works. Noam Chomsky and Jeffrey Sachs and these other intellectuals actually understand NATO's history. And they understand the governments like Libya, Yugoslavia, or they didn't end up toppling a government in Yugoslavia, but they understand the regime change efforts, murderous regime change efforts launched by NATO, like Syria, Afghanistan, Yugoslavia. And in 2022, NATO held a global summit, and they said that their number one challenges going forward, their number one focus going forward, is going to be Russia and China. I'll find the exact part right here. No Cold War. At the summit, NATO made it clear that it intends to continue its global expansion to confront Russia and China. Seemingly oblivious to the immense human suffering produced by the war in Ukraine, NATO declared that its enlargement has been a historic success. Where's the part? The strategic concept, NATO Southern Door. I'm trying to find the summit that they had. Where they said, okay, here we go. Gathered in Madrid for their annual summit. At the meeting, NATO adopted a new strategic concept, which had last been updated in 2010. In it, NATO names Russia as its most significant and direct threat and singles out China as a challenge to its interest. So NATO, this military alliance of Western countries who in the last 2 decades has done nothing but murderous regime change efforts, has done nothing but topple foreign governments and arm and fund extremist, nationalist, terroristic groups to see their own interests carried out abroad, is now saying that their number one focus going forward is Russia and China, and then they're building up a troop presence in Ukraine right on Russia's borders and backing a bunch of, you know, the U.S.'s preferred extremist groups in Ukraine. So you think it's mystical to assume that this is a real threat to Russia? That this military alliance with a history of invading other countries and toppling their governments is building up military forces right on their border and singling them out as the number one threat going forward? No, it's obvious that NATO was threatening Russia. You would have to be a dumbass with your head so far up your ass that you can't see left from right in order to really, really, truly believe that. Or you just have to know nothing about the history of NATO over the last 2.5 decades.
Amateur historian began making self-aggrandizing ventures into the past, looking for role models for himself. And he came to think, perhaps Alexander III, that he was special. He got the feeling that Russia's cultural destiny was now tied to the will of a single individual, Mr. Putin. This sense of mission came years after the 2007 speech at the Munich Security Conference. There, Putin too wanted to reject the post-Cold War European settlement, but his later rejection of it took on a more mystical quality.
Зачем нам такой мир, если там не будет России?
The left, and to be fair, many in the West.
Dude, where is your evidence that Putin sees himself as the inheritor of the Russian Empire? As some kind of czar? You've showed 3 videos as evidence. You have showed a video of Putin looking at a statue of one of the czars. You've showed a video of Putin saying that NATO is building up their troop presence in Ukraine, and we see this as a threat. And now you've showed a video of Putin saying that we don't want Russia to completely cease to exist. Right? A Russian president wanting Russia to still exist on this planet is not the same as him seeing himself as the inheritor of the Russian Empire. Right? These are very big claims, and you actually have to provide evidence for these claims. You can't just make these claims, show some vague videos that don't prove your claim in any way, and then just move on. You would get a D on this if it was being graded by a professor.
Deal with the Putin regime as though it were Brezhnev, whereas in fact it is closer to it.
Sorry, Sebastian says the evidence is years and years of Western propaganda that creates preconceptions that leads to no need for evidence of claims like this. Exactly. Exactly, Sebastian. Because there's been anti-Russia propaganda pumped out to American citizens for the last however many years, a lot of them just assume Russia bad, right? This guy's saying bad stuff about Putin. Probably true. I've been told my whole life that Russia bad. So he doesn't need to provide any evidence for these very specific claims that he's making. And these very bold claims like Putin sees himself as a Russian czar. Okay, provide some evidence, right? If Putin standing outside of a statue or standing in front of a statue doesn't prove that he sees himself as a czar, right? There's plenty of videos of American politicians looking at statues of, I don't know, Abraham Lincoln or Confederate generals. Right? It doesn't mean that they see themselves as the inheritors of that legacy. Although maybe some of them do. In the case of American politicians and seeing themselves as the inheritors of the Confederacy.
Like a radical terror organization invoking holy values to justify violence. But here we have to concede a point and allow.
Again, huge claim, no evidence. Right? If I said the U.S. is the world's biggest terror organization, I could list off evidence for the next hour. It'd be like they dumped arms and weapons into the Mujahideen throughout the 80s and 90s when they were fighting against the Soviets. And the Mujahideen would splinter into Al-Qaeda and ETIM and all these different terror groups that are still around today. The U.S.-backed extremist terror groups in Syria like Jaish al-Islam and all the biggest extremists, they shipped extremist groups into Libya. They took extremists who were living in Chad and moved them into Libya so that they could topple the government and destabilize the government. They backed the Kosovo Liberation Army in Yugoslavia, armed them to the teeth. A group that was formerly listed as a terrorist group. In Iraq, after the U.S. invasion of Iraq that destabilized the country, ISIS was allowed to emerge. So the U.S. ultimately created ISIS, which was also a result of us backing extremists in that region who were, siding with our economic interests. Right? If I was going to call the U.S. a terrorist state, I could list off evidence for an hour. Like I said, this guy calls Russia a giant terrorist state, leaves it at that. Huge claim. Huge claim. No evidence to convince us that his claim is correct. What terrorists are Russia backing? What terrorist groups has Russia created? What terrorist groups has has Russia armed and funded in Ukraine? None. How many terrorist extremist groups has the U.S. armed and funded in Ukraine? More than none.
Nuance. NATO expansion was handled badly, and Western leaders like Bill Clinton knew that when they were doing it. Before we tackle this, let's clarify the infamous not 1 inch to the east promise. Was there a promise? Promises were made repeatedly, but they weren't formalized. So here is my analysis. A politician can promise another politician something by saying it, but a state cannot promise another state something without formalizing it on paper. And when we look,
this is such a cope for the U.S. Yeah, the U.S. and NATO promised Russia that they wouldn't expand repeatedly, but they never put it in writing. So who cares that they carpet bombed Yugoslavia and armed a bunch of extremist groups and pushed their sphere of influence closer and closer towards Russia's borders after promising not to? They never wrote it down on paper, which, I mean, Putin has said that the biggest mistake any Russian politician ever made was not getting an agreement from NATO on paper, was not getting a signed contract from NATO saying we won't expand 1 inch eastward. So now propagandists for the U.S. like Vlad here can cope for the U.S. by saying, no, we're allowed to break all of our promises and international agreements so long as we don't write down that we made them.
Look at the formality, we see that the Kremlin signed a treaty explicitly allowing the expansion of Article 5 eastward. When Putin says that Russia got fooled, he is half right. Mr. Gorbachev got fooled because he was an extraordinary leader and a poor negotiator. But the Soviet Union, being a state, didn't get fooled because states don't make promises to each other that aren't on paper. And what then followed was that the East European countries wanted to run away from Moscow and join their own security alliance. Because when Russia invaded Ukraine and nearly took Kiev in 2022, this wasn't the first time.
It had nothing to do with US-backed color revolutions and nothing to do with NATO expanding their troops and their sphere of influence eastward. All those Eastern countries just wanted to join with the Great West and turn away from Russia. It had nothing to do with U.S. influence and the NED funneling money into preferred political groups in these countries.
There was Budapest in 56, there's Prague in 68, and there is Poland in
How many years later now? Like 80 years later, and they're still just showing videos of tanks to demonize Russia and the Soviet Union. That, you know, this is where the term tanky came from. They showed videos of tanks when the Soviet Union was rolling into Hungary or something and said, look, Soviet imperialism, they're bringing tanks. And now years later, it's the same thing. Look, they have tanks. Clearly, they're the bad guys here. They have tanks.
81, when there weren't Russian tanks in Warsaw, but there were Polish tanks ordered from Moscow. But as Mary Surratt argues in her path-breaking book, the problem wasn't that NATO expanded, the problem was how NATO expanded. For example, there was a possibility of a more rapid but more diffuse expansion, which is what Clinton wanted, partly because it would avoid creating a line by leaving Ukraine on the run end of it. Either way, as Mary Surratt argues, nothing was more conducive to radicalizing Russia than expanding NATO in small tranches. But while this radicalized Russia, NATO expansion is not a primary cause of war. Centering it doesn't account for the domestic regime security causes of war. And as we have seen, reducing Putin's sense of mission to grievances about NATO expansion over-instrumentalizes his worldview. We are not looking at a guy who wants to alter a couple of moves on a board game. We're looking at a guy who wants to take the board game and throw it off the table. And
so there we go. That's classic American liberal analysis. To give reasoning for what the U.S. is doing abroad. You take the leader that you're trying to boogeyman, you take the leader of the country that you're trying to destabilize and destroy, and then you just psychoanalyze him. And you say, this is the craziest, most evil, irrational actor. This is the same argument that Vaush made in our debate about this. So ignore all of the context, ignore all of the legitimate security threats to Russia, ignore all the years of NATO expansion that the U.S. did despite promising that they wouldn't expand NATO. Because Putin's an irrational actor. He's so crazy. He's so tyrannical. He's such a bad guy that we just need to take him out. We can't trust anything he says, you know, and nothing he says could possibly be true. So anyone who even sounds like him, we automatically have to dismiss as a puppet of Putin. Same thing they did with Saddam Hussein, right? Same thing they did with Assad in Syria and Gaddafi in Libya so the U.S. could back a bunch of terrorists and destroy those countries. All right, this guy's so bad. This guy's so evil. He's a villain ripped straight out of a comic book. So listen to the U.S. State Department, trust the U.S. State Department, and do whatever we say. Support all of our murderous wars abroad. Support all of our sanctions. Support all of our bombs. Putin bad. Saddam bad. Assad bad. Gaddafi bad. They're all bad. Don't look at Joe Biden and Hillary Clinton and Obama and our own leaders who are starting wars every freaking week. Gaddafi bad. Putin bad. Psychoanalyze them.
There's something else that the NATO expansion did it argument implies, and that is that Putin's imperialistic death spiral serves Russia's national interest. But any thinking Russian should know that Putin's actions are destroying Russia's future and increasing the odds that Russia may not exist at all. And there is an even more striking omission in that argument, and that is Ukrainian agency. Since 2014, Ukraine has come together in a civic bond powered by anti-colonial sentiment. And it's only an ungrounded newspaper clipping approach to political understanding that could lead Noam Chomsky to say that Ukraine wants peace more than weapons.
Yes, it's naive to not want to send weapons to Nazi groups. It's naive to not want to send weapons to IDAR and Right Sector and all of these Nazi forces who hijack these legitimate protests and use them to overthrow the Ukrainian government. The far right-wing forces who massacred people with snipers in Ukraine and who burned 24 trade unionists alive in the trade union building in Odessa in order to escalate these protests and turn them into a violent Nazi-backed coup. It's naive to not want to send them weapons. These are anti-colonial Nazis, don't you know? They're Nazis that we need to support in the anti-colonial struggle. Like, I wonder if Vlad Vexler here supports sending weapons to Mali. Does he support sending weapons to Gabon or Burkina Faso or any of these any of these African nations who recently had anti-colonial coups and kicked out the French? Why is it that he's saying that we need to send weapons and support to these protests that were hijacked by Nazis in Ukraine, but he doesn't want to send weapons and support to the anti-colonial movements against U.S. power and against the U.S. and European sphere of influence in Africa? I wonder if that's politically motivated or ideological in any way.
Colonial sentiment. And it's only an ungrounded newspaper clipping approach to political understanding that could lead Noam Chomsky to say that Ukraine wants peace more than weapons. Likewise, both Putin's sense of regime security and his sense of mission are not compatible with an off-ramp. My interpretation is that Putin wants a big war against the West, but in several years from now. Meanwhile, he wants a low-level, minimally globalized war, during which Western...
Putin does not want a war with NATO, dude. What evidence do you have that Putin wants an all-out war with NATO? Russia did everything they could to avoid this conflict. He thinks the invasion of Ukraine is just a small scale, and then Putin's eventually gonna fight all of NATO. Do you think he's suicidal? Do you think he wants nuclear war? Do you think he wants the wrath of all the NATO countries who currently have missiles pointed at Russia to come down on his country? Of course, that's not what he wants. But that's what the U.S. neocon government is pushing us towards every day. And that's why we need to get our shit together as communists and do something about this government that's run by neocons. But I hope you guys liked that video. It was completely, I mean, that guy pretends to be objective, right? And he says things in a measured voice, in a measured tone, and in a way that sounds intelligent and well thought out. But it's the same propaganda we've heard time and time again. Right. And it's the same wild claims about Putin, psychoanalyzing Putin, the comic book villain, making these wild claims about Russia as being an international terrorist organization and then providing no evidence for your claims. Just saying these are true. Russia's evil. Putin's evil. Therefore, trust me. Trust the U.S. State Department. Trust Joe Biden. Trust Victoria Nuland. Keep shipping weapons into Ukraine. Keep just giving them blank checks. There's no Nazis. No Nazis there. Trust us. Right? They're complete and total democracy. Nothing Putin's saying is true. Just keep sending them weapons. Keep pushing the Ukrainian people into their death. Vlad Vexler. All right. Hopefully we don't have to deal with that guy ever again. But unfortunately, I fear that that will not be the case. $22 for 22 years. Happy birthday, Sebastian. Thank you so much for supporting the project. Man, I feel bad to be taking your birthday money, but hopefully you got some birthday money. I appreciate you so much, though. Sebastian sent us, I don't know if he sent us the Vlad Vexler video. I think that's a video I just came across myself. But he's sent us a lot of our content over the past few days. So appreciate Sebastian for always keeping the Discord popping with good suggestions, always keeping the stream popping by giving us stuff that we should react to. Appreciate it, brother. Debunk oversimplified Russian Revolution. I will. That's on my list. It's written up on my, what do you call it? Whiteboard over there. My whiteboard. Opposing the Korean War would be alt-left, I guess. Yes, these same people, they would have said the same thing about all the Cold War interventions. They would have said it's all just alt-leftism. Everyone who doesn't want to support the U.S.'s Cold War interventions is part of the alt-left. All right, I got to run to the bathroom quick. Here's a video of me wrestling to keep you all entertained. Where is it? Joy, I'll be right back.
263.
More than 20,000 events a year can be watched live on demand across the Flow Sports Network, including today's event. Download the Flow Sports app for your Apple TV, Roku, Amazon Fire, and Chromecast. So with your mobile device, all you gotta do is go to Flow Sports, iOS, and Android app. That's Flow Sports, L-O Sports.
How am I doing? It's actually a nice headlock by him. I stopped it though, you dumbass. Suck it. All right, what else do we have here? Let's watch Jacob's TikTok, because I don't think we're going to get through our 9/11 section today. I just don't think I have enough time for it. So we'll jump into this TikTok that our comrade Jacob sent us before. Oops, now we're about to get a crazy echo. Where is it? There it is. Found it. Let's check this out. Apparently it's about communism and fascism.
Most
topics
people
that
are
we
familiar
regularly
with the
discuss here on the show. So let's see. You had to debunk this little kid, Jacob? He looks like a nice lad.
famous fascists.
Oh boy, here we go again.
We all heard that they
Found out yesterday that the major news networks, CTV News in Canada, employs Stefan Bandera, Stefan Bandera's grandson, who has the same name. Holy cow. Not only are they just employing Banderites nowadays, they're employing Bandera himself. And people will still deny that the Western media loves Ukrainian Nazis. That's hilarious.
They both hate communists. Now, for some people, that means, oh, they hate communists. That must mean that fascism is extreme capitalism, right?
Yes, that is exactly what fascism is.
Yeah, pretty much. Pretty much. How does one decide what wrestling style to specialize in? Just got to do whatever you're good at. Got to try them all. And if you have a proclivity towards one or the other, go hard in that direction.
It is capitalism in extreme decay.
Absolutely not.
Well, shit. Just when I thought that this kid was a little bit based.
Capitalism basically is that a large portion of the economy is controlled privately. Fascism is basically the opposite of that.
Oh no.
Jacob, why are you roasting this poor child? He's just confused.
Oh, bro.
Where basically everything is under the control of one entity, that's the government.
That's not how any of the fascist regimes worked. It's not how any of them worked. There were giant corporations who were in cahoots with Hitler and Mussolini and funded their rise to power because Hitler and Mussolini promised not to do away with big business.
That is what fascism is. Exactly the opposite of what capitalism is.
Also, what's really interesting is Hitler enriched himself too. Oftentimes he's portrayed as just this, otherworldly evil who was so evil he wasn't even worried about material things. He wasn't even worried about things like money or big business. He was just worried about being evil. But actually, there was like a law that was made where his face was on all the stamps in Germany, and anytime someone used a stamp with his face on it, he would get like half the money from it. So him and the people around him accumulated great wealth. They enriched themselves greatly as their corrupt and violent cabal took power on the backs of big businesses. And one of the big businesses that funded Hitler's rise to power was Prescott Bush, the grandfather of George Bush. So the descendants of Nazi collaborators and Nazi funders and people who helped the Third Reich rise to power are now the leaders of America. We had a Bush political dynasty in America. They tried to give us another Bush, tried to give us Jeb Bush, but we've had enough of these Bushy Bushes.
It's that dumb horseshoe theory argument. Socialism and fascism have big government and authoritarian states, so therefore they're the same. It's almost like this kid got the definition of socialism and fascism from this guy. Or from this right-wing libertarian Tommy Wiseau knockoff. Like to say that the...
Why you gotta do razor fists like that, bruh? No, he is. He is a Tommy Wiseau knockoff. Oh, hi, Mark. Oh, hi, socialism.
knockoff. Like to say that there wasn't any form of private industry or any other type of private ownership of the means of economic production, distribution, and exchange under fascism, which is what fascists have always sought to protect, is completely ahistorical and lacks historical literacy. Fascism occurs when, in severe economic decay and crises, the national bourgeoisie uses authoritarian and reactionary means to preserve itself. They do this by propping up and funding the most far-right reactionary groups, and once these fascist groups come to power, they immediately implement policies that solely benefit the national bourgeoisie. And while in power, the fascists enrich themselves because their class interests aligns with the national bourgeoisie in defiance of both the international.
This feels like one of those setup videos where parents make their kids say something that a kid would never come up with for views on Facebook. It does, doesn't it? Seems exactly like that. Jacob's debunk and explanation of fascism is good. I guess that guy, Stefan Bandera's grandson, has been working for Canadian media for a long time. He's been a producer for programs like W5, which is similar to 60 Minutes. Wild. Banderites in the media. I know that Kayla Pobachet wanted to do a video called Bandera in New York, where she just showed all the Ukrainian Nazi supporters and collaborators and Banderites in New York. But, I think she was targeted by a bunch of Ukrainian fascists then, who targeted her employment and targeted her specifically. And so I don't know if there was a pause put on that project or not. But
bourgeoisie, and first and foremost, against the workers. This is evident.
I always tell Republicans and Trumpers that the deep state's greatest enemy is Hitler's greatest enemy, communism. That's exactly right. Exactly right. That way you're correcting the historical record about communism and the way it's always stood up against fascism. And you're explaining to Trumpers and right-wingers who think that everything bad in the world is communism, that communism isn't their enemy. Communism is what they need to liberate themselves from our current corrupt government controlled by neocons.
In every case where fascism has been implemented, like in Mussolini's Italy or Nazi Germany. Let us refer to the first chapter of Michael Parenti's Black Shirts and Reds. Both countries were in severe economic decay and crises. Following the First World War, Italy was in a post-war economic recession, and Germany was forced to pay the most in reparations for the war. They were forced to pay an amount that Germany, obviously didn't have. The national bourgeoisie of both countries wanted to maintain what little they had and increase their profits. So, what did they do? They started to fund and use groups like Mussolini's black shirts and the Nazi stormtroopers to protect the businesses and private property of the big industrialists and landowners. By protect, I really mean busting up labor strikes, smashing all the trade unions, and using acts of terrorism to harass pro-working class political organizations and outlets that were in constant opposition to the fascists, like the Socialists, Liberals, Catholic, Democratic, and Republican groups. And it was the communists that endured the most severe repression during the fascism, described as a prototype for...
Very true, Jacob. Very good explanation and good sourcing with black shirts and reds there. I'm glad you taught that young kid a lesson, or his parents who propped him up to say that communism and fascism are the same thing. Who is using that kid's cuteness and his young, innocent face to sell the idea that communism and fascism are the same, that they're both totalitarianism? So ridiculous. I told something similar to a Trump friend recently. If the media lies about him, how much more will they lie about communists? Exactly. Exactly. That's how you got to explain it to people. You know the media is lying. You know that. So why would you believe that they're telling you the truth about communism? You know Fox News is lying about Trump, right? You should know that they're lying about communism too. All right, everybody. I got to head out to wrestling practice. This was a great show. Thanks for joining the Eddie Liger Power Hour today. This was a lot of fun. Thank you to everyone who sent in videos. Happy birthday, Sebastian. Thank you to our moderators, Cobra Commander, and Ware Pilgrim. Sorry we didn't get to the 9/11 video and the manufacturing consent video today. I want to, but I got to go to practice. So without further ado, or with that, I guess, we'll see you next time.
Cannot be solved without a radical redistribution of political and economic power.